welcome. I'm Dee Perry, and I am welcoming you to the Cleveland International Film Festival's official podcast, CIFF Speaks. This is day 5 of CIFF43, and I'm here to tell you more about it with my producer, Aaron Spears. Hello, Aaron.
Hello, Dee, and hello, film fans.
You know, one of the things that Aaron's going to talk about a little bit later in this podcast is today's film forum. But Aaron, before we get to that, thinking about film forums in general takes me back to one of my favorite memories from an earlier festival. I think it was CIFF40, a film forum that I was involved with in terms of being a moderator, and it was for a documentary called Romeo is Bleeding. And it was about this community in California that had these young people who were in a community that was full of challenging kinds of issues, economic, social, and one of the ways that they were dealing with that was through spoken word. So they were writing their own poetry and performing it, and some of the participants got the idea to translate Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet into a spoken word, a kind of a hip-hop influenced version of Romeo and Juliet. And it was really a thrill watching on film these young people transform their social experience through poetry, and then hearing them talk about how that film and that whole experience had transformed their lives. And it just reinforced again the power of art in general. So I've got to say, I am a big fan of film, the forum, and all that it can do.
That's actually a shared memory because I was in the audience for that screening because I remembered you being there. And also Romeo's Bleeding went on to win the Roxanne T. Mueller Audience Choice Award that year.
Yeah, thanks for that heads up. And that also reminds me, you usually tell us a little bit about other things that are going on that might impact arriving at the festival.
That's true. We usually give you a heads up on things going on, but it's just the festival today downtown here, so come on down.
Absolutely. And that means, though, we can get right to our interview.
Absolutely.
Jennifer Baichwal, it's such a pleasure to get a chance to sit down with you. But in the interest of transparency, I should mention that while we are talking, you will be photographed, and listeners, you will hear the clicking of a digital photographer and have a chance to see those photos online. Jennifer, thanks once again.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with a bit of background. I was reading that you earned a master's degree at McGill University and were studying for a PhD in theology and philosophy, but along the way you became attracted to filmmaking. What made films a more satisfying way for you to explore humanity and the way it impacts the world?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question because I really was on the road to an academic life, but I got very frustrated with the method of inquiry and the idea. I mean, my thesis was on Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian, and I'm pretty sure that only 3 people read that thesis, me, the outside reader, and my advisor. And I kind of thought, wow, this is a medium of inquiry that engages the intellect only. And I was trying to look for more lateral ways of exploring the same questions, which I'm still preoccupied with, in a medium that was more accessible to people. And so I applied for a grant. The Canada Council is an arts granting organization, federal arts granting organization in Canada. And you didn't have to have any experience to apply for it. It was called Explorations. And so I thought, I want to make a film about the problem of personal identity, and I got the grant. And so that film was my school, essentially. But as soon as I started doing it, I just knew I'd found what I loved to do. So that was the beginning.
And in saying that it was your school, did you get formal training from someone or follow someone, or you just got equipment and said, let me figure this out on my own?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have, interestingly, Nick, my husband, didn't go to film school either. He learned from, being first a driver and then a production assistant and then an assistant gaffer on big sets that came through Toronto. And in the meantime, he was always making little dance films himself as the cinematographer and the director and the editor. So he learned that way. And I learned I had a friend who was in film school who knew how to operate a camera, but that was it. So we learned, when we edited that film, we had 2 VCR machines and VHS tapes. And that was how that's how we started to edit, and just hours and hours of interview material. Anyway, it was a really interesting way of delving in. And I also think that, because I teach film now sometimes, that it was good to not have formal training, because I didn't feel constrained by anything. Anything went, really. And so the openness that allowed, I think, was really helpful to me at that time.
Yeah, I see in your films a language that is very different from what I'm used to seeing in other standard documentaries or even feature films, and so it sounds like that's an outgrowth of you're just not hearing from anybody, no, you shouldn't do that.
Yeah, well, one thing that I thought from the very beginning, and it's something that I tell my students too, and I don't teach very often, just once in a while I'll do a graduate class, is that in documentary, visual language is almost always subordinate to concept or text or story. So it's always used to back up or fill in or cover cuts in interview material. And that's just completely unacceptable to me. Like, I feel as though the visual language has to have a completely organic and metaphorical and symbolic relationship to whatever the concept is or the text is, but they have to work and have meaning at the same level. And once you sort of I started with that, thinking, okay, well, this is a starting point. I'm never going to relegate visual language to that level. And so I forbid anybody, like my editors or, students, to use the term B-roll. I hate that term, because it that's what it means. It means this doesn't mean anything. This is just being used to cover something else. So I think I sort of started with that conceptually, and then especially the work with Ed, which got more and more complex visually, almost like you were leading with visual language. That took us in another direction.
Dee and I were discussing your films before you got here, and we were trying to figure out, there's those kind of unofficial subgenres of documentary styles, and we were having a hard time placing you in sort of that, but in a good way. And we mentioned the Koyaanisqatsi and the Scotsy trilogy. Did you have kind of documentary influences that you look to for inspiration?
Yeah, and interestingly, it was people like, I'm a huge Chris Marker fan. I'm a Herzog fan. There was a filmmaker, I love Chantal Ackerman's work. And then people who are my friends, like Alanis Aboomsawin and Nettie Wild, who are fellow documentary filmmakers in Canada. But Donald Britton was a big influence on me, and he made this film called Volcano about Malcolm Lowry, the sort of life and death of Malcolm Lowry. It's such a beautiful, weird film. And it was the first time I noticed, like, he used the Mexican Day of the Dead as a kind of visual metaphor for Lowry's descent into alcoholic madness, basically. And it was so powerful, because there was this, on the one level, this sort of, totally mundane people walking around, having a coffee at night in a fluorescent lit place. But then the underlying kind of sinister possibilities of interpretation when you are in that paranoid state was also there at the same time. And that, I was just blown away by that way of making films. And he would, so that, yes, I was very, and I loved Saint-Soleil and Chris Marker's work because of the fact, first essay filmmaking, but also not following a very particular kind of prescribed journalistic form.
Right.
Was there a film that you can point to, an earlier one, where you were able to look at the finished product and say, this is where I began to mature in the creation of my own personal cinematic language?
I was in the Q&A yesterday. We had an awesome screening, but I was talking about how, because some people saw all 3 films, which is pretty intense in one day. but all three of the trilogy, Manufactured Landscapes, Watermark, and Anthropocene. And I haven't done that. So I don't see, I mean, I can't, maybe I'm just too much in it to see that I have a sort of trajectory of style, because I feel as though every film is like a universe. Every film is like doing a PhD in a subject. It takes us, you know, between 2 and 4 years. Anthropocene was nearly 5 years. And you just get to completely immerse yourself in this, not just in the subject, but in all the concentric circles that come out from that subject. That's sort of the way that I research. So it's very research intensive. It's like a year of research, and starting with the center and then moving out. When I made the Paul Bowles film, which was our first feature, I read everything by him, and then everything about him, and then everything by his wife, Jane Bowles, and then everything by his friends, Truman Capote and Gore Vidal, and that circle of writers, and then everything by the beat writers that he became friends with later, William Burroughs and Allen Ginsberg and Orlovsky, and it just was this bigger, you know. So that sort of, anyway, I'm digressing, but I guess I'm saying that I don't know what that is. That's for other people to look at, because I don't see it myself. I see all of these things as being like universes of their own that are strung together somehow.
And I guess one of the things that for me was a continuing thread in not just the trilogy that you mentioned, but in earlier films of yours that I've seen, is that you play with time and expectations in a way that a lot of filmgoers aren't used to these days. For instance, Watermark begins with this wonderfully powerful gushing of water, the silt release, I think, in China on the Yellow River. And I'm watching it in real time, and it feels like it goes on for 10 minutes. But I got a DVD of it and then played it back and said, that was only 2.5 minutes. So there's a meditative quality that draws a viewer in, not just in that film, but in other places in many of your films. And I wondered what the thought process is in the length of time that you let viewers dwell with images.
Well, so I guess I can say that conceptually there are similarities in the work and a kind of philosophy of filmmaking. And one of those is this, when you're in Manufactured Landscapes, for example, sort of like the beginning of Watermark, there's a very long dolly shot through a factory, and it goes on for a whole magazine of film. It's almost 10 minutes long. And it was this, you're looking at Pertinsky's work, which is all about scale, industrial scale, and how do you convey scale in time, in a time-based medium. And that shot, it was really interesting because, first of all, we blew through a week's allotment of film in one day when we were shooting it. But I knew when we had finished that it would be the opening of the film, and that's never happened before. And it was because it was the perfect expression of scale in time, because you start off, you're kind of intrigued by what you're looking at, and then you get sort of bored, and then you get angry, like, why am I still looking at this? And then out of boredom and anger comes a recognition of scale. And so that, I do think that conceptually, this creating a space for sustained reflection without being told what to think about what you're looking at is something that I deliberately do. And in Watermark, the whole ambiguity of that, we are used to seeing that kind of power, water gushing, as a natural force, right? And so you kind of, at the beginning, think, wow, is this a flood? Is something terrible happening in nature? And then you realize that this is an entirely human created event. And that was the whole point, human interaction with nature. But how do you reveal that in a way that is not just saying, oh, and by the way, this is a silt release? So I would say conceptually, I'm always trying to lead in a way where it destabilizes a viewer a bit. So then you really are paying attention to what you're looking at. But at the same time, there's a huge ethical dimension to the way that we interact and engage. which is very much about doing all of that research, then sort of forgetting it when you get into the context, because it's an incredibly arrogant thing to point a camera in somebody's face, especially when you're going all over the world. So to me, the only way of entering into these environments is with humility and with a conscious relinquishing of control. And that's very hard to do when you have a big crew, you're spending a lot of money, and, you know, the sort of caricature of the baseball cap wearing white male director who's, you know, in charge. I'm the opposite of that. Like, I hate that stereotype. But it also means that when we're in these environments, we shoot a lot, and we're always trying to sort of allow the context to reveal itself to us, rather than us saying, "Oh, we're here for this reason. We're shooting this because it's supposed to do this." I never feel like that, and that means that there's an enormous amount of material, and the work is kind of written in the edit room where we can play around with those ambiguities.
I can't believe I hadn't thought of this previously in preparation for this, but you mentioned in manufactured landscape shooting a magazine of film. How has that changed for you in your production over the years, especially with that ratio of what you film versus what ends up being used in the film or in the completed film, shooting on film versus digital video? And we also wanted to check in with you on VR, which you have a couple VR films in the exhibit this year. How is sort of the medium that you're filming on? Has that changed at all how you shoot over the years?
Well, we always shot a combination of video and film. I mean, in shorter pieces, we could just use film. And in fact, Manufactured Landscapes was all Super 16 millimeter. And it was the last film that we shot on film because of 9/11. It became impossible to travel with film. Because you had to do hand checks of, you know, and so you've got a black bag, and, you know, the customs officer's hand is in one side and yours is in the other, and, you know, it takes hours. And a few times we missed our flights because of that, and so we realized that it was over after Manufactured Landscapes. But we always shot a combination of video and film because the interviews were done in video, because again that allowing the context to reveal itself. You know, I'm not going to prescribe what somebody says or, you know, hurry them along because I'm worried about wasting film. And so our Paul Bowles documentary, we did an interview with him. The interview was shot on Betacam. It was 30 hours of material. We did it over 10 days, spent 3 hours with him every afternoon in Tangier. But then all of the visual language in that film is shot on 16 millimeter with an old Arri ST camera. And that was interesting because every time we turned on the camera, we had no money. So we had these 100-foot rolls, and we had limited film. And so we'd have to say, is this a Bowlesian moment? Is this a Paul Bowles moment? Before we turn on the camera, like, what is Bowlesian about this? And especially when you're in other countries, there's this tendency you can either devolve into an exotic idea of the other place and trying to show that. So not doing that. And then also, what is it that connects this to the theme? So we had to be much more rigorous when we were shooting film in that way. And then when we started shooting everything in video, I thought Nick got quite sloppy about, you know, like he would just sort of, sometimes he'd forget to turn off the camera when he's reframing and stuff. And I would always remind him, you know, I look at every single frame that you shoot. I sit in the edit room with Roland and sift through 300 hours. So just know that when you're doing that, I'm watching it and I'm wondering what your intention is. But interestingly, those transition points sometimes have these unexpected gifts. And so now I don't sort of say that anymore to him. But we do, I mean, our ratios went up for sure. But because we always had that video element, they were always kind of high.
And then with the shooting with VR, like how has that reframed, like how you just visually conceptualize your approach? Well, I guess you just recently started shooting that way.
I mean, for Anthropocene, it's a feature film, documentary film. It's also a museum exhibition, a book, and an educational program. So all of these elements were being done at the same time when we were on location. So we'd be shooting film. Ed would be taking photographs, and then we'd have a crew with the Google jump. That's how we started. up somewhere else because you can't be around if somebody's doing 360 or you're in the shot. So they would go to a different part of the location where we are and do the 360. But we also did something called photogrammetry, which is augmented reality. So there's 360 VR, but then the augmented reality is almost like a virtual sculpture in space. So we, for example, in Anthropocene, there's a scene of the ivory tusk burn that is a sort of anti-poaching event that happened in April of 2016 in Nairobi, Kenya. And we mapped the biggest tusk pile before it was burned, which meant taking thousands of photographs all around it. And we also did it with Sudan, the last male northern white rhino, and then stitching those together in software to create a virtual sculpture. And so in the museum exhibits, you could hold up your phone or your iPad, and there'd be a trigger, and the trigger through an app would trigger that Sudan would be standing in the middle of the museum.
Oh, wow.
You would see the tusk pile was in the middle of the museum at scale, like they were huge. And so those were the new elements of lens-based work that we were pushing in this project. And it was really interesting. First, we had huge crews, bigger than we've ever had before, because we had to have all of those cameras and people doing each one of those things. But it was also about trying to extend the experiential understanding that we have tried to do in the work into the medium of the museum. So, instead of just having photographs on the wall and video installations on the wall, how do you bring people in? And that was why we turned to 360 and photogrammetry.
Excellent.
And you've mentioned your editor, Roland Schlimm, with whom you've worked for a decade more. What's the advantage for you of having that long-standing relationship?
We are fortunate enough, I think, that we basically have worked with the same team. I mean, I've edited with other editors, but Roland has done the big work. For the first half, it was David Warnsby, and the second half, it was Roland Schlimm, and in terms of my career, so probably for the past 15 years. And there is when you're sitting with somebody for a year in a dark room looking at material, it's an intense relationship. I spent more time with Roland than I do with my husband in that year, and it's because there is no script, because there is no sort of preconceived idea of what it's going to be, but more a kind of conceptual, a philosophical basis of what it is supposed to be. It's a journey that we go on together, and it's intense, and I trust him implicitly because we've done this so many times, which is not to say that we don't have, arguments. We're kind of, sometimes butting heads about stuff, but he has every good editor is a musician like that. I mean, every good editor has some kind of musical background, at least in my experience, because editing is all about rhythm, and I sort of inherently understand that rhythm, and he does in an exquisite way. So I'm almost never fine cutting with him, like, oh, shave that a few frames, it's not working. He gets that. It's the big picture stuff that we do together. But also we work with the same sound designer, we work with the same mixers, we work with the same colorist, and that's really been for about a decade now. And it just feels so great to be able to have this ongoing conversation with people who them and they know you, and they're rich relationships.
And on the note of relationships, how did the photographer Ed Bertinsky become part of what began as you and your husband Nicholas doing films?
Well, when did I make The True Meaning of Pictures? I think it was in 2001 or something. I made a film about a photographer, Shelby Lee Adams, who took pictures in Kentucky, in the hollers in the mountains of Kentucky. And he was, there was a lot of debate around his work that he perpetuated stereotypes in his work. And I thought that his photographs were a perfect sort of arena to explore the problems of representation in documentary, because, you know, representing reality it's an ethical minefield, right? And so, and then when you as a documentary filmmaker are showing that work in a film, you're also subject to all of those questions, those ethical questions of why are you showing this work? And so the layers of representation, the layers of consent, the layers of how people in different parts of the world look at that work. Like when you're looking at pictures of people who are, living sometimes, in poverty, in an art gallery in Berlin where people are, drinking champagne and looking at those pictures. There's something weird about that. But so the whole film was about uncovering those layers of representation and also our implication in those layers of representation. And I remember when the film was finished, Shelby and I took a VCR and a generator, and we went around to all the families who we had filmed and showed them the film and got their notes before we locked picture. That was my way of answering my own ethical, position by representing. And it was interesting because at first Shelby said, I want to have a say too in the piece. And I said, no, you can't, because you're the public figure. You're the artist. When you put your work out there, you have to be open to the fact that some people are going to criticize you or whatever. If I let you have a say, then it becomes a puff piece. Then it becomes a vanity project. But the people, your subjects, and therefore our subjects, absolutely have to have a say. So it was a really interesting process. But anyway, Ed saw that film, and at the same time, a friend of ours, Daniel Iron, who we've worked with as an executive producer for many years. In fact, he helped us in our first film. He got a whole bunch of footage, about 100 hours of footage that an amateur photographer had taken of Ed, had sort of traveled around with him, but couldn't really make it into a film, and said, I have all this footage. Do you want to look at it? Can you do something with it? And I watched it all and then sort of realized I couldn't do a film with just that footage, but I could use it in a larger project. And that's how we went and talked to Ed. And because he had seen that Shelby Leigh Adams film, he already knew about our work. And we embarked on this journey together. And it's been 13 years since that beginning to the end of the trilogy. Yeah.
Jennifer, your films Manufactured Landscapes, Watermark, and Anthropocene have been screened at this year's festival as a retrospective in honor of your receiving the CIFF Director's Spotlight Award. What's been your experience with CIFF over the years, first, and what does the award mean to you?
Well, I'm very grateful that I managed to get here this time, given that, I had some travel delays, and I missed the introduction and Q&A for Watermark, which I deeply regret. But all those films have played here at the festival, and this is such a close city for us. Like we're, it's like me driving to Montreal, right? It's and so I mean, the idea of being spotlighted as a director kind of makes me squirm a bit, going back to that idea of, what is your body of work? The body of work is about each of those things. I think of myself as a director. There's this great book by about Walter Murch, Michael Ondaatje, interviews with Michael Ondaatje and Walter Murch, called The Conversations. And Murch says that the director is like the immune system of the film. And that's how I feel. I feel like my job is to let in anything that makes the film stronger and then keep out things that make it weaker. And film is a very collaborative process. So I feel a little bit just embarrassed about being spotlighted as a director. But at the same time, enormously gratified, and it's a wonderful honor. And I got this beautiful piece of art, this light box that I know exactly where it's going in my office. So I'm honored and grateful, and also, as I said, a little bit embarrassed about being pinpointed.
One more thing, because it takes so many years for a project to develop, I'm curious if you're in the midst of something now.
So normally, I mean, it's interesting, the whole release process of a film, which is, it's fun, and it's also, you're doing what you wanted to do, which is get that out in front of people. And it's incredibly gratifying. Like yesterday, I had such great screenings here, and really, informed, smart audiences, dedicated audiences. And you can tell, like we have that at TIFF too. You can tell when the audience is really good and that they're film literate and that they're passionate about it. That was evident. And that's very uplifting as a filmmaker to see. So I had that yesterday. But the whole release period is also a period where you're not working, right? You're not generating income. You're not working on the next project. And because this one has been so complicated because of the exhibition and the book and the education program, we haven't quite got to the next phase yet. So right now I am starting to research our next projects, and it is kind of that artisan thing where they go one at a time. But if we were maybe a bit more efficient, we would be having 3 or 4 things going at once, but we just don't work like that. So
that's actually a good thing for us. We'll all look forward to whatever is next. Jennifer, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me here, and for the award and the honor, and for this conversation.
This is CIFF Speaks. I'm Dee Perry with Aaron Spears. And Aaron, film forums are a really interesting part of the festival where some speaking happens in person.
Yes, the film forum today this one really fascinates me, because when I say the word Playboy magazine, we all are probably picturing the same thing in our heads right now. This one is Hugh Hefner's After Dark, Speaking Out in America. Hugh Hefner did a television program called Playboy Penthouse for a while that was really progressive and had a lot of legendary performers in there. James Brown, Tina Turner, Sammy Davis Jr., Buddy Rich. So this one is a bit more of a celebratory kind of film today, a documentary. It still has some pretty weighty social issues there, but the topic for today's film forum is at 11:20 a.m. showing of Hugh Hefner's After Dark is how far can we push boundaries before they push back?
A timely topic for these days and times. Once again, we're talking about the Cleveland International Film Festival and all that can happen here. To get here, you might want to consider RTA and Lyft. They are the easiest ways to arrive at CIFF43 in style. And all RTA trains and many bus lines provide direct service to Towers City Center. We also have an official rideshare, Lyft, which offers discounts for CIFF customers. To keep up with everything CIFF, visit clevelandfilm.org, follow CIFF on social media, or use the CIFF app. I'm Dee Perry.
I'm Aaron Spears.
And thanks for listening to CIFF Speaks.